Hi guys, Talisha from P3 here. Today we're going to be discussing why musculoskeletal injuries need movement and how clinicians' hesitancy to load injured tissues can actually do more harm than good in the long run. Now, if you haven't already, I encourage you to head to progressivepodiatryproject.com/blueprint and download our movement prescription blueprint. This is a free resource I've created that helps guide clinicians through the exercise rehabilitation thought process, and it cues you to capture the relevant information and the considerations that you need to make when you're formulating exercise programs for your clients to achieve successful treatment outcomes. So head to progressivepodiatryproject.com/blueprint. You can download it there, and now we'll get into today's video. So when it comes to managing musculoskeletal pathologies, clinicians are often faced with a fear of causing further damage to an injury. And not to mention, they also oftentimes are plagued by this uncertainty on how to navigate rehabilitation in the presence of pain. So oftentimes what will happen is a clinician will be hesitant to load a tissue, and what this can do is actually impair the recovery process, prolong an injury, and lead to potential re-injury occurring later on down the track. So today what we're going to do is explore a couple of elements that we need to consider and improve our understandings of to hopefully overcome this fear of movement when it comes to rehabilitating MSK injuries. So probably the first thing that we need to reframe in our minds is that understanding that loading tissues as early as we can and as much as we can actually improve our rehabilitation outcomes. And this can look like a faster return to sport, return to work, or even just reduced risk of re-injury, and overall a lower socioeconomic burden for that individual and the injury as a whole. Further to this, if we delay, avoid, or underdose loading in our rehabilitation programs, we can actually prolong the recovery process, not to mention increase the risk of re-injury later on down the track, and overall we can just impair the functional restoration of that individual to return to whatever activities that they're hoping to get back to. Now, this applies to both acute and chronic injuries with a little bit of nuance in between the two. So what happens if we don't introduce loading soon enough to acute injuries is we can actually delay and prolong the recovery process. And then something that happens, and it can be an offshoot from a mismanaged acute injury, or it can just be an injury of chronicity, is we can perpetuate the boom-bust cycle if we're not loading enough to deliver this functional restoration of an injured tissue. So what this will look like is we'll perpetuate the boom-bust cycle. So what the boom-bust cycle is, it's a 4-stage process that people typically follow, and you would have seen a lot of clients that do this, and it's essentially a bust followed by someone feeling good, followed by an activity boom, resulting in a pain flare, leading to a bust. Then we rest and immobilize and feel good, we boom, pain flare, and that's the cycle that goes around. So as clinicians, we want to break that cycle, and oftentimes how we perpetuate this cycle is overdosing our rest or immobilization and underdosing our exercise rehabilitation and functional restoration. So they're the two things that we need to address if we are to break this cycle. So what will happen is typically you will see a client when they're either in the pain flare or the bust stage of this cycle. So typically what will happen is, and this is again in the case of chronic musculoskeletal pathologies, where we've had a boom, so whether or not it's an increase in mileage or frequency or whatever, we've just done too much for our tissue to tolerate, it doesn't like it, it leads into a pain flare. Now, sometimes a clinician will see you at the pain flare stage where there's a pain flare happening. And then what can happen is it can be the clinician that decides this person will go into a bust, where the bust is will rest too much or immobilize completely. Or a client, they may elect to do this. So they've done a high bout of activity, it's resulted in a pain flare, and then they've elected to just stop activity altogether. But either way, we end up in this bust where we're not really loading the tissue much at all. And so what will happen is, of course, if we're not loading a tissue, we're going to feel good because we're not exposing the tissue to any load that may trigger a reaction or trigger reactivity within the tissue. So we're not loading, we feel good. And then because someone feels good, then all of a sudden because they feel great, will jump back into our activities. And often people will chase the intensity that they were doing just before they headed into the previous pain flare or the bust cycle. So they'll do this boom where there's a rapid surge in physical activity, and the body might tolerate that for a short period of time, but then we flare again. So then we head into pain flare, and then we head down, and this is how that cycle perpetuates. So what we need to be considerate of is, like I said, we don't want to overdo the rest and immobilisation, and we don't want to underdo the functional restoration of the tissue. So that's essentially a synopsis of the boom-bust cycle. Now we'll explore a few more elements. So circling back around to the two main problems that clinicians face and how this can perpetuate that boom-bust cycle with our clients is there's two things that we need to understand. So the first thing in relation to chronic musculoskeletal pathologies is we need to understand that pain does not always equate to tissue damage. There can be other mechanisms at play. That's not to say that with a chronic Achilles tendon pathology, if someone's had a bit of a bust or a pain flare, there may be some elements of inflammation present. So this isn't going over the top with pain science and nociception and everything like that. It's just that's one thing that we do need to understand. And the better we can understand this, the better we can help our clients understand this and help them navigate their rehabilitation in the presence of pain. And by doing this, we can build their self-efficacy. We can overcome these barriers where pain is often that barrier to increasing our physical activity. So what we'll do, or what often happens, which is problematic, is if there's this pain flare, we can go a bit heavy-handed with the resting or the immobilisation. So, and it's a safe bet because, like I said just before, is if we're not loading a tissue or exposing it to any form of stress, of course it's not going to feel pain because there's no top load exposure happening. So, but what we need to be considerate of is it's that whole, if you don't use it, you lose it scenario, right? So if we're resting and immobilizing completely, then we are losing tissue tolerance or capacity to tolerate load. And so what can happen is if we've rested, yes, we might feel good, but we may have reduced someone's load tolerating capacity even further, which can, again, move the goalpost even further away for returning to our physical activities. So yes, in some instances, there will be a level of reactivity or inflammation that we do need to decrease load. It's just we only need to decrease it to what I call the minimal effective dose. So we deload to that minimal effective dose, which is where we just deload to a point where symptoms begin to stabilize and plateau, where we can start to build that load tolerating capacity of the tissue. So for someone, let's just use someone that runs 10 kilometers over the course of a week, just because that helps my math brain. Okay, so for someone who's running 10 kilometers, it might be a little bit of trial and error, and that's the beauty of chronic musculoskeletal pathologies. Is when they're chronic, there's very rarely an acute tissue assault that's happened, so we're likely not impairing the healing of a ligament tissue. So we can be a bit fluid with our trial and error of how we deload someone. So instead of just going, okay, 10 kilometers in a week, that just aggravates you completely, no kilometers this week for you. That can be a little bit heavy-handed for some people. So what you may do is go, okay, let's reduce it by 25% and see how they go. So you may go from 10 kilometers a week down to 7.5 kilometers a week, and there may still be some level of reactivity, which is pushing them into that discomfort or pain. Okay, so we may want to reduce that a little bit further. So we may reduce the load by 50%, so go down to 5 kilometers a week. And then that person may find that they can run 5 kilometers per week, no problem at all. So we'll maintain them at that and then build upon that to reintroduce more load, improve their load tolerating capacity. So that is going to get them back to their physical activities a lot sooner than going, okay, 10 kilometers a week, it aggravates your tissue, we'll go to 0 and then just throw an arbitrary amount. Okay, we'll do 0 kilometers for 2 weeks and then just start to reintroduce it. So you may have actually moved the goalposts further along, introduce an overdose of underloading, and then, prolonging the recovery process. And then further to the minimal effective dose for load, this is where it also comes into play with acute injury management. So there's a fair amount of literature that supports early mobilisation of musculoskeletal injuries, like, for example, ankle sprain injuries. So with studies as far as time to return to sport or return to activities, those that engage in early mobilisation as opposed to prolonged immobilisation, they actually return to their activities sooner and have better pain responses. So all healing tissues need movement. It's just we need to introduce load that's not going to flare the injury or cause further tissue damage. So this is where our understanding of tissue healing timeframes is very important when we're managing acute injuries. But essentially, for acute and chronic injuries, we need load. Now, this is not exclusive to any particular tissue. Bones, tendons, ligaments, and muscles, they're all undergoing a constant state of cell turnover. And this is even just normal day to day, and our body will adapt accordingly. So if we're physiologically loading, that is, we're engaging in activities or applying loads that are either maintaining our tissue homeostasis or we're positively adapting. So we're just little by little increasing our tissue strength or our tissue quality, whatever it is. Now, if you picture it a little bit like a bell curve, so within the center, we've got our physiological loading where we're either stable or positively adapting. And then either end of this bell curve, this is where we can head into non-physiological loading. And it can be one of two things. So we can be overloading, so there's too much, or we can be underloading, so there's not enough. Because at any given point in time, every second of every day, our cells are in a constant state of turnover and they need movement and mechanical stimulus to basically trigger the correct cellular adaptations to occur. So if we're not introducing movement or participating in any movement, then our body is lacking that cell signaling to do the correct laydown. So our body will adapt to the load it's exposed to. And it can be a positive load or a negative load. So, and the negative load can be too much or not enough, or we're positively loading. So we're just maintaining or positively adapting. Now, as I said, as our cells are in a constant state of turnover, with an acute injury, we have the inflammatory phase that gets kicked off pretty well as soon as the injury starts, and it can last for up to a few days, depending on the severity of the injury, individual factors, medications we take. But essentially, once that inflammatory phase has settled and it's on its way out and we begin the proliferative phase, this is essentially when we need to start loading. And this can happen as soon as a few days after an acute injury. And again, it depends on the type of injury, the severity of the injury. So how much we load a grade 3 ankle sprain as opposed to a grade 2 and a grade 1 will vary considerably. And it's kind of up to the clinician to have that understanding there. But again, we want to load as much as we can with respect to the tissue healing timeframes. And why it's important is if we're not loading, once we kick into that proliferative phase, which again is only a few days after an initial tissue assault, our body needs that cell signaling to lay down the cells and trigger the correct enzymatic and cellular responses for that tissue laydown. And it's always, if we kind of think about it, it's better to do it right the first time as opposed to slap something together and then try to rebuild and adjust it later on down the track. So, and that's often what happens, because if we rest and immobilize and prolong that and go for too long, then the cells, yes, they will have laid down, but have they laid down in a way that's going to tolerate increased loads as we start to reintroduce movement? So yeah, again, loading as much as we can as soon as we can. The same premise, only minus probably that acute inflammatory phase of an acute injury, comes into chronic injuries. So our musculoskeletal tissues, like I said, are in a constant state of turnover. And if we think about the tendinopathy pathology continuum that was proposed by Jill Cook. And it's kind of been adapted, and I agree to this, actually quite to an extent, actually to a lot of extents, that applies to the plantar fascia as well, in my opinion, because if we look at the structure of the plantar fascia and tendons, especially tensile tendons like the Achilles tendon, very high densities of type 1 collagen, which are there to tolerate strain loads, and they both serve to store and return energy. So I feel that the structure of plantar fascia and Achilles tendon, very similar. Function is also very similar, and this is also where the high load strengthening from Michael Rathleff has come into play. So that's essentially applying the thought process of how tendons adapt to load to the plantar fascia, and we've seen quite positive outcomes and adaptations from this. So sidetracking a little bit, but essentially in chronic injuries, tissues are undergoing a constant state of turnover. So we need that constant movement stimulus to trigger the mechanotransduction to have that cell signaling convert into the cellular responses. So again, circling back to Jill Cook's paper, is we know with the pathology continuum that yes, there are some cases where there'll be tissue changes and disruptions, so they've headed into tissue disrepair or tendon disrepair, those tendon cells, we can't reverse what's happened there, but the rest of the tissue the healthy tissue will respond positively. So you may not alter the structure, but you can alter function. But if we take one step back, where we're in that middle zone where there are some changes, but they are potentially reversible. And how they're reversible is if we decrease the pathological loads and then increase a positive load to trigger cellular adaptation. So, and this I'm sidetracking a little bit, but this is also why there's that argument against passive therapies. So I'm not anti-passive therapy. I'm anti-overutilization and over-promising what passive therapies can deliver. So with active therapies are any movement-based therapy, which it can just be engaging in your activities of daily living or prescribe exercises and movement for rehabilitation. But essentially, we need this activity to trigger those cellular responses and cellular processes to have positive adaptation occur. So this is where reversing pathology and having positive adaptation can happen in chronic injuries. Now, if we're not introducing any active therapies and we're purely relying on passive, this is where we can also be perpetuating that boom-bust cycle, because say we're doing dry needling. Dry needling, we know it works primarily from, there's still so much uncertainty around it, but what we do know is it's mostly a neurological response. We get some downregulation of pain signaling. So we'll have this window where there's a period of time where someone's pain symptoms may decrease. Now, when we're not introducing any load-based activities, which again can just be reintroduction of activities of daily living, if we're not reintroducing some load to start triggering that positive adaptation, then this is where we might see symptoms improve and then they go back down. They're back a week or two later, and it's just rinse and repeat. And this is why clients get so frustrated when they're just shelling out money and not making any positive strides towards recovery. So utilizing the treatment window if we're doing passive therapies. So if we've applied dry needling, we've created this treatment window where there might be a period of time where there's decreased pain. Then we want to utilize that treatment window we've just opened to introduce some load to build some positive adaptation, increase that tissue tolerating capacity. And that over time is how we can restore tissue integrity and improve function. So again, very important to get our head around why we need load. Essentially, it's all the passive therapies in the world aren't going to trigger that cell signaling that needs to happen as a result of movement and movement-based therapies. So if I had to give you my 3 golden rules of loading, one different golden rule, but I am going to steal this quote from Greg Lehman because I love it. It essentially is we need to calm shit down and then build shit up. what this actually means is we need to triage and prioritize our therapeutic goals accordingly. So essentially what it means is inflammation and reactivity trump reloading. So we need to, because you can't load a reactive tissue or overload a reactive tissue and have a positive response. It's not going to like you. So when there's inflammation present and we're highly reactive, we just need to decrease to that minimal effective dose where we get stabilization of symptoms. Once symptoms have stabilized, so we've calmed it down, then we introduce load to build it up. So that's the first golden rule. Second golden rule is we want to load as much as we can as soon as we can. And this is more in relation to, well, it's in relation to acute and chronic injuries, but more so in relation to acute injuries. Again, because as soon as that inflammation window has passed and we're heading into the proliferative phase, which can happen as soon as a few days after the injury, we need that cell signaling to trigger the positive adaptation. So we're having positive tissue adaptations. And an example of this is with our ligaments. There's a 4-zone gradient that exists where we've got the osseous interface through to the 4th zone of the ligament proper. Now, if we're not applying tensile load as much as we can, as soon as we can, post-injury, say a grade 1 or grade 2 ankle sprain, essentially we can lose restoration or we don't achieve restoration of that 4-zone gradient. So then the ligament, once it's healed, it doesn't function completely like a ligament should. So we want to, again, load as much as we can, as soon as we can. And then the final one is we need to remember that pain does not always equate to tissue damage. And this is something that's important for us to understand, but it's equally as important to help our clients understand that as well. So I do have another video that goes into this a little bit more in depth. That's the how to navigate rehabilitation in the presence of pain. And this is where I discuss the traffic light system when it comes to exposing clients with chronic plantar fascia and tendon pathologies to self-dosing their rehabilitation using a discomfort scale. So you can head over, read that blog or watch that video, and hopefully that gives you some insight there. So that'll do it for today, and hopefully this video has given you a better understanding of why musculoskeletal injuries need load for long-term functional restoration. Now, as I mentioned at the start of the video, we have our movement prescription blueprint, which is a free downloadable resource to help guide you through the exercise prescription process to help you get better rehabilitation outcomes for your clients. So head to progressivepodiatryproject.com/blueprint and you can download it there. And like I said, that's it for today. I'll catch you in the next one. Thanks, guys.